Everyone thought she was dead, until a cowboy heard her inside the collapsing mine. The line hung in the air like dust motes lit by a dying lantern. Red Hollow's shaft gaped like an old wound against the scrubbed slope, a collapse of timber and stone still smoking where the bores had thundering through. Men had come and gone that morning with the same low, fatal look. A shaft blocked, a path lost, a woman gone with the falling earth. They stacked tools and shook their heads and began the list of what must be done without her. They counted the costs and the claims. They made decisions as if a body had already been signed and wrapped. Down in the darkness, something tapped. Nayeli Redfeather felt the first weight of rock like the hand of winter closing over a mouth. The shock was immediate. A scream trapped halfway between her lungs and the stone, and then the world narrowed to sand on her tongue, the bitter smell of oil from the lantern and her own breath in her ears. A slab had taken the entrance. A wall had rolled like a wave and pinned her against an old rail, one knee catching a timber brace. The boars had come like a living avalanche. She had been running back from the low pasture with a satchel of roots, thinking only of Thomas's fever and the thin pulse at the base of his throat. Now the satchel lay beneath rubble. The roots were crushed. The mule outside stamped and left the bridle against a fence. Outside, men would make reasonable assumptions. She could have given in to the cold, to the weight. She did not. It is a hard thing being an Indian woman in a white town and being expected to be invisible. Nayeli had learned long ago how to supply herself, how to read the way water ran soft against rock, which root mellowed a cough, how wind on a plain told of a storm 3 ridges over. She turned her head until the lantern's wick caught her eyes, tiny, stubborn flame, and she tasted smoke and copper and the iron of her own stubbornness. Pain flared where a splinter had bedded into her calf. The leg below the brace felt pinched and numb. She tested it, listening to the bone, to the whisper of tendon. The rail at her shoulder was rusted and cold. The rail was old. It had been pushed into the mine years back to guide ore, and now it was, for her, a lever between life and immobility. She found a stone, sharp and clean. She used the stone to lever, the way her grandmother had taught her to pry a stubborn jaw of a trap. Small movements first, breath measured. She did not let panic into her hands. Panic would make the stone slip. She worked the rail until the wood and the metal shifted enough to roll a fraction. She pushed. The stone bled her palm, but she did not feel it except as proof it was still there, the living skin. There was a moment when the brace groaned like a beast, and then the leg slid free, raw and slow, and she pulled in a single grateful gulp. Once free, the next orders came cold and clear. Check for wounds, find water, tend to fire, make a plan. The lantern was low. The air in the chamber tasted of dust and old iron, and the fall had knocked the satchel from her shoulders into a pocket of rubble. With small, careful movements she dug, finding at last the torn leather and the roots, half smashed but still fragrant under the oil. Thomas's name balanced on the inside of her mouth like prayer. A fevered child slept at home without the herbs to cool it. She fed the lantern more oil and wrapped a strip of cloth around the stump on her leg until the bleeding slowed. Then she saw the saw marks. At first, she thought the collapse had shattered a failing brace. The labor of silence left its shape in jagged timber and splintered cedar. But when she touched the cut, fingertips numb from chill and dust, she felt the clean, deliberate line of a saw. Timber made for an old mine did not snap so neatly. The support beam had been weakened in a way that meant someone wanted the shaft vulnerable. A fuse lay along the wall, thin black cord tucked into a seam, threaded from a small bundle of powder-pocked cloth into the heart of the chamber. Nayeli had been taught early how to recognize the smell of powder. The town's new digging had its own dangerous language. Her jaw settled as if around a stone she could swallow. Sabotage. It could be no accident. She traced the fuse's direction with trembling fingers, and then she stood still and listened. because that is what she always did when the world made less sense than it should. Beneath the drip of water she imagined the spring. The spring. Red Hollow's slow, stubborn vein of clear water that fed the troughs and the wells and the fields below was what the mine men wanted to claim. The company's draft maps had put the water under property lines they could change if they changed the ground. Water was a kind of gold here, and where there was gold, men would quickly forget the faces who had lived on the land before paper deeds. Her mind scrolled through what she could do. Find the charge, and then find the exit. She had found one survival. Now she had to keep living long enough to find another. She made a list on the back of her teeth. Hold the lantern, patch the leg, follow the fuse, sever if possible. And most urgent of all, get out with proof. If there was a man outside who had thought the collapse convenient, documentation would be the thing to hang on him. There was no time to think like that for long. The mine had its own slow breath. The trickle of water was already louder against the new rock. A draught found her from deeper in the shaft. That explained why the fuse lay there to begin with. Somebody had intended to light it and let the flow of the spring break under the pressure of a blast. Or else they'd meant another sort of split, one that would take the source and leave the people who relied on it. Nayeli touched the fuse again. She could snuff it, but if it was lit from elsewhere, it would matter not to this spool of cord. She would have to find where the line met the charge, and what else had been positioned in the dark. Outside, the town moved through its morning rituals of loss. Men favored the collapsed mouth and peered in, as if a glance could make a body appear. They spoke in the soft, efficient terms of frontier misfortune. Wasn't no way through. We'll have to bring the shovels. Women spoke in lower voices about Thomas's fever and the herbs missing from his satchel. Word moved like smoke. Nayeli Redfeather had been in the mine when it fell. People assumed death because that is what grief and convenience do. Absence, and the thing the town felt they had to do next, fill the hole and call the insurers, curled together easily when it meant money and a clean ledger. The presumption hardened until it was almost a new fact, and then Caleb Morgan found the mare. Caleb had been out early with his stock. He had the look of a man used to reading small things, a hoof print in a soft patch of dirt, which direction a mule chooses to stand in the wind, how a blanket hangs when tied poorly. He found the mare at the fence, bridled but without a rider, flank glossy and shaking from the run. A split in a blanket caught on a thornbuck, and the thread of salt on the soft leather told him there had been a quick drag. He followed the hoof marks with the patience of a man who tracks cattle, not people. The tracks led to the other side of the knoll, and then the ground pinched off into the smell of coal and wet stone. There was a smear of red on a flap of leather, like a token of haste. The blanket lay snagged over a bush. Caleb ran a hand over it and found the stitches come loose as if by rough fingers. He straightened and looked at the shaft, at the broken timber that had come down, and for a moment understood the town's assumption. Then, like a line pulled from the water, he heard it. A faint, regular sound, a tap against rusted rail. 3 taps. It was a small thing, barely more than air-cutting wood. And yet the sound had the clarity of a bell in a place where men had forgotten to listen. Caleb took a step toward the rail until his boots were above the seam. Then he crouched and pressed his ear to the cool iron. The rail carried sound like a living thing. He heard the taps again, slower, as if from deep underground. For a moment he simply held his cheek there, letting the thin rhythm fill the empty space of his mind. He did not need to be anyone's hero to know that someone alive beneath a pile of rock was a different problem than a dead woman. Mercy, after all, required no license. He cupped his hand over his mouth and called down into the shaft in a voice low enough to not startle those listening. "If you're there, answer with your name." The tap came back, a reply against metal. Nayeli's voice was small when she freed it. Nayeli. That single exchange shifted the morning. The men who had already begun to assume did not stop their ledger-keeping easily, but the rhythm of the taps broke the neatness of convenience. Caleb stood and did something that would annoy a great many men of business. He did not report it to the company first. He went back to town and to the corral as if it were a thing anyone would do, as if the sound of a human might be enough to call out the decent part of a person's nature. "If you were there, would you have heard her?" he said to a man on the street who had been moving ledger papers. The man shrugged and said nothing. He had not pressed his ear to the rail. That question is the sort of small appeal that functions as a CTA in a world of horses and hard choices. Will you listen? And it is the one that slows a story into being heard. Stay with them for a moment. Would you have heard her? Caleb did not wait for the world's answer. He gathered two men, Ben Mercer, the foreman, who had the tired look of a man under orders that had begun to feel like chains, and another ranch hand who knew how to break a lock. The three of them returned to the shaft with pick and rope. Ben watched the gut of the collapse and said, "The way a man says things when he is weighing cost against consequence. Best we let the company handle this. There's permits and whatnot." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had the patient face of a man who wore solitude like a coat. When it came off, his hands showed calluses and readiness. "If a person answers Ben, we don't wait on permits." Ben's look was unreadable for a breath. He had been there long enough to have glimpsed where loyalties shifted, between pay and conscience, between men with paper and men who had to sleep with themselves at night. He reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a small roll of oilcloth. In it were a map and a pencil-line plan for the mine's western tunnels. He did not volunteer it. Still, he did not hold to the company line either. He handed both to Caleb, and the gesture was a small moral pivot. They found the ventilation grate bolted low and rusted. These mines prized ventilation vents because air kept men alive, and weak old hopes didn't. The grate would usually be handled by the company, but when a life answered from below, the law of decency outran the law of paper. Caleb shouldered the bar. They pried, cursing the iron and the dust. A guard on the ridge shouted down, a tired warning to stop. The company did not like interlopers. A shadowed figure appeared, and in his polished hat and clean boots was Silas Crow, the sort of man who always smelled faintly of soap and paper and a plan. "Move back," Crow said, the words as smooth as a ledger's curve. His eyebrows were set in the perfect angle of someone who had decided a person's death was an acceptable collateral. "This ground is company property. It'll be dangerous." Caleb looked up at him. He had never liked the softness of Silas's manner. Crow's jaw was the kind that makes deals and looks for the shortest path to profit. "Someone's alive down there," Caleb answered. "I heard her." Crow smiled in the way a fox smiles after the hen leaves the yard. "If someone's down there, we'll follow the proper channels. We have engineers on site. There are safety protocols. You don't want to make a bad situation worse." His tone implied that the "we" who would act and the "we" who would coordinate included Crow and the company men first. The life of the woman beneath the rubble had suddenly become a liability to be managed. Ben's hand flicked toward Caleb. He wanted to leave the argument, to avoid the crack that would form between the company and the men. But Caleb did not step away. He had felt the tap on the rail. He had heard the voice say, "Nayeli." He could not allow a stranger's convenience to decide a life. He shoved the bar through the rust and forced the grate enough to slip his arm into the dark. Crow's face went harder. He did something coy then. He stepped back and called to his men. "If you persist, Mr. Morgan, I'll have you charged with trespass," he said. The threat was thin paper over iron will. It suggested he had resources loyal to his side. Caleb hated paper. He preferred the language of action. He reached down and tied a rope to the bar and dropped it into the black like a promise. Ben looked at him, and the two men exchanged a look that said they were not entirely the same man, but they could be the same when it mattered. A guard tried to stop them. Caleb's hand was quicker. He pushed the man aside without malice, just the blunt, necessary shove of someone who had to go to where hands mattered more than permits. "It's not my company," he said to Crow, soft and steady. "It's a woman." Silas Crow's smile tightened into a line. He went off to his wagon as if to fetch something, tools perhaps, or orders. There was a rustle of papers and a sharp cluck of language that wanted to be reasonable. Later, when it would matter, men would call this a confrontation between a moral farmer and the company man. For now, it was 3 men in the dirt and a woman's voice answering beneath old rails. Caleb descended, Ben following. The shaft swallowed them in that particular silence mines have, muffled and thick with history. The air grew cool and slick against skin. The lantern threw a small pool of light and then retreated like a nervous animal. Every sound came bigger in that space: breath, rope scraping wood, the drip of water. They followed the rail where it went into a broken chamber and found the pile of detritus that had pinned Nayeli's leg. She was smaller than the stories would imagine, but as steady as a knot. The lantern light made her cheek glossy with dust. When she saw Caleb's face, her expression did not break into relief or foolish gratitude. She measured him with the kind of appraisal that is more businesslike than sentiment. "You listened," she said. The words were a report more than a thank you, and there was some warmth in how they landed. He nodded. There was something about the way she said her name in the dark that made him understand how little she had to prove to survive. He lowered himself beside her and checked the fuse with a hand that did not tremble. They worked with a companionable silence that is the beginning of trust. Nayeli showed him the saw mark on the beam. She pointed with a finger that smelled faintly of crushed root to the thin cord tucked like a secret into the seam of the wall. "Company?" Caleb asked. He wanted to hold the simplest of truths and not bury it in accusation. Nayeli's mouth flattened. "Someone paid," she answered. "Someone wants that spring out of our reach." The words came like stone thrown into water. Water was a public thing here. The spring was a resource that fed every well downstream. The idea of someone moving it for gain held the room like cold air. There were names people whispered in the street. A company moving water would be bad enough. Deliberate sabotage to cover wrongdoing would be worse. They huddled and read the chambers lie together. The fuse ran eastward toward the old powder store. A small stash of blasting cartridges lay tucked in a shelf just off the main drift, enough to punch a hole if all were used, but not an indiscriminate demolition. The company men outside had knowledge. The man in the polished boots had motive and access. The law hacked in paper the rights to move lines. People who lived and drank from a spring had only the memory and the mouth. Ben looked on with an expression like a man in the middle of choosing a direction of travel. "You're saying someone planned this?" he asked. Nayeli nodded. "Whoever cut the brace wanted the fall to be tidy. Then they put a fuse to cover the reason the ground moves." She paused and put a hand to her forehead. The lantern light threw her skin into planes of shadow. "Thomas got a fever last night. I came for banks of willow root, bone set. If I die here, he'll have nothing." Caleb felt a cold like hollow wind vignetting his ribs. Men often spoke of courage like it was a rare thing. In a place like Red Hollow, courage was constant and ordinary. Nayeli had walked toward danger because the alternative was to leave a child to suffer. That was a kind of bravery that required no story. They made a plan with the sound of survival: shorten the fuse if possible, get proof, find another exit. The ladles of oil from the lantern made a tiny shine in her eyes. "We can cut it near here," she said. "If I can get to the west drift, there's an old ore way that leads toward Dry Wolf Canyon. If we open it, the water will have a place to go without tearing the rest of the mine. It is quick fortune against our people if they hollow the spring and pretend the bedrock ran dry. I won't let that happen." Caleb absorbed the map Ben had given him in a way that men of the land did, by tracing the fingers over the pencil lines, imagining the lay of tunnels like watercourses. He trusted her knowledge of water. She trusted he would take action. They moved with that small, precise cooperation that makes two strangers into partners. He held the lantern while she worked to trace a path. She taught him which routes might help him stop bleeding if they needed field medicine. He watched for falling splinters and missteps. Above ground, the company's men gathered like a shadow that wanted to pass as governance. Silas Crow stepped in the softened earth and barked instructions with the efficiency of a man ordering curtains to be closed. "We will secure the mouth. No one goes in until the engineers arrive with charges and safety gear," he declared. The way he pronounced safety gear made it sound like he had planned the danger for someone else to walk into. Men from the company began laying out sacks and ropes with the methodical pace of workers, assigning blame to machines. There was paper signed on a desk in a wagon a ways off that made the world tidy and accountable in ways that favored property rights over people. But paper did not answer a tap on a rail. A tap on a rail was a plea in iron. Silas Crow had a ledger, and he had the company's men, and he had Ben's uneasy loyalty to consider. He also had another thing, the ability to light a fuse in a place where men down in the dark would be forced to hurry or drown. It was a small, clean cruelty to light a line and watch it go. He had a plan for the spring. Move it, and the land above it would belong to the company's claim. He told himself other things, too. Permitted engineering necessary to mine safely, the county's need for ore. The justifications were only half-truths to a man who had placed his hand where paper and power met. Back under the stone, a bell-like worry began to sound as a breeze increased in the shaft. The sound was subtle at first, a hiss of the fuse. Nayeli touched the line with a finger that did not shake and found that portion blackened at its end, as if it had been lit and then smothered long ago. It might be an old burn, she told themselves, but better to act as if it were new. They worked to sever the line. This is where a woman's hands taught by careful life shone. Loops and knots, cutting and pinching, oil on cloth to smother anything that might flare. They had to be precise because false moves could start a fire, or worse, seal a fate. The mine remembered every misstep. Caleb held the lantern and passed instruments with the steadiness of someone who had hefted saddles for years. Ben's fingers, rough and pragmatic, did what was asked. They cut the cord and then inhaled so hard they sucked dust into their teeth. For a breath, it felt like victory. They had severed one run. Nayeli wiped soot from her wrist and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. There are smiles like currency, and she spent it knowing there were bills still to be paid. Above ground, however, the world had not stopped. Silas Crow had been watching them from the rim with a careful eye. He did not intend to let 3 hands in the dark undo his plans. When he saw Ben's wavering loyalty, he moved. Someone had to be outside with hands on the lighter. Crow had a way of moving that suggested inevitability. He would not risk being caught flat-handed. He took a match and struck it in silence. There was a small, human cruelty to the way a man can light a fuse and call it decisive. He lit a second spool just under the mouth of the mine, where, if the charge took, it would break another wall that would send the spring sideways and make the company's maps more profitable. He watched the faint orange crawl into the woven cord with a face that refused to be seen as small. In his mind, his ledger already balanced. In his mind, he had already written the incentives that made him believe it was necessary. The flame ate along the twine like a truth that moves too fast. The men above laughed too easily because the harm would be someone else's kettle to bail. They thought no more of the woman who sat cross-legged with a lantern in the dark, and whose name they knew only because sound had insisted on answering. Below the severed cord was the first small mercy. Yet they had only solved one problem. The new line Crow had lit outside would meet the charge that the severed spool had not reached. Their actions now mattered, as if balanced on a beam. Water began to gather sound in the western drift, a murmur that hardened into a shuddering. The spring was restless. Nayeli put a pale hand to the old rock and felt it, the way a midwife feels the shiver of a baby's back before a contraction. It was wrong to feel that the land itself could be read, and yet she had been taught how to listen to ridgelines and to scent the eyes of her life along the lines of old water. The spring would not be forced to obey contracts and phrases. It obeyed pressure and gravity and the path of least resistance. If the company made a new hole, it would carry the water away. Caleb looked at the thin thread of smouldering cord, and then up at the mouth of the mine, where light cut the dark wedge like an accusation. He saw men moving with purposeful ease around a wagon, as if the word company excused haste. He felt the air change on his face. The smell of powder was faint and cruel. "We have to get to the west drift," he said, and there was no question in his voice. "If the water finds that old route before we can open it, it'll tear through the chamber. It'll swallow this whole shaft." Nayeli's hands were steady, but her eyes showed the raw math of a woman out of options. "We'll need a small charge," she said. "Not more. Just enough to blow the western seam open to Dry Wolf Canyon. Not enough to collapse the rest of the mine. If we make the canyon a way out for the water, it will spare the shaft." Caleb's mouth tightened. The law of explosions was not his domain. He had led cattle into storms, not powder into darkness. But war and industry had both taught him. If the charge was too small, they would waste rock. If it was too big, they would lose themselves. The problem then was not courage, but calculation, where to place the charge and how to set it so the earth would move as they wanted and not like a beast. Ben swallowed. He was not willing to carry the name of saboteur in the open. "You'll light it?" he asked. Nayeli shook her head. "I must hold the line. My hand steadies better here." She looked at Caleb. "You have to do it." The decision set a weight on him. He could see the math. One small charge meant risking the last of what little safety they had. It also meant making a wound in the rock to relieve the pressure. He had no training in blasting. He had only the steadiness of a man who listened. Above them, the ground rumbled with a sound like a great thing shifting in its sleep. The new fuse's glow grew nearer to its meeting with the powder. There was a metallic ring inside the rail, as if something small and sharp were being dragged along. Time tightens in such places. The three of them gathered their instruments with quick, careful fingers and prepared to move. It is here, at the point when decisions are matter of fact and yet the world holds its breath, that the story pauses and the stakes tighten into the shape of one line. One fuse remained lit. One fuse remained lit. Its thin orange crawled like a beetle along cords so old it might have come from another age. Every breath in the shaft tasted of dust and powder. They moved faster than careful. There was no time for careful to be leisurely. Nayeli felt the heat more than she saw it. Heat crawled along stone. The trickle in the western drift had turned from murmur to a hard, urgent voice. She reached for the powder shelf with fingers that had learned small economies, how to divide root for teas that would cover a child's fever for 3 days, how to portion salt when a herd had eaten half the winter stock. She handled the cartridges as one handles a sleeping thing, with both hands and without surprise. Enough to make a hole in rock, no more. Enough to make a place for the spring to run, without turning the shaft into a grave. "Where will it open?" Caleb asked. His voice was a dry piece of rope. He had not been a man of explosives before today. He had been a man who moved cattle and read sky. Now he moved like someone learning to make a small destiny. Nayeli ran a finger along the pencil line Ben had given them and tapped on a place where the line thinned, old ore work, a worn seam that angled toward Dry Wolf Canyon. "There," she said, "not too near the chamber. Far enough to let the water find the canyon's mouth and not this place." Ben squinted. He was the sort of man whose face had settled into small truths. If you lie about a thing, he could smell it in how you tie a knot. He had watched the company's men and had seen the softness of orders that were not for him. He knelt and helped pass cartridges, tamping clay into the gap to make the blast go where they wanted. They worked by the light of the lantern. Their shadows slid along walls like second hands on a clock, counting down. Above ground, the world had unspooled into panic and procedure. Silas Crow stood with his hands in his pockets and a matchbox between his fingers. He had given a quick practice speech about safety and engineers. Men nodded because they had mouths and jobs, but Crow knew the work of men's minds too. If the west seam opened on its own, if water ran off into Dry Wolf Canyon, he would lose the paper balance he had been drafting in his head. That was not acceptable. He had a match that would make the balance tip back. The faint hiss of the second line grew louder. Caleb could see the glow through the seam where the match had taken. He felt the tiny schematic of panic, a line of flame hungry for powder. Below the light of the lantern, Nayeli's jaw set like a door. She could not see the match outside, but she could hear the rails ringing and feel the air move when men above breathed wrong. "You have to put the charge in and light it," she said. It was not a request. Her instruction was a small, sharp business, a plan with breathing. Caleb swallowed. He had never asked to be remembered in a ledger. He had never been the sort of man who thrives on being named a hero. He was a man who listens. He nodded once, then took the cartridges from Ben and set them into the seam as Nayeli directed. She watched his hands. She marked the place where the charge should direct the rush of water, taught by the years of knowing where a river would take a spilled load. Ben packed clay and gravel around the cartridges, tamping the cavity so the blast would shatter the seam ahead of them and not the chamber behind. They worked orchestrally, 3 hands and 1 held breath. The lantern swung once, catching them like a thin mercy. They tied a stout line to a cart axle and ran it over a wheel so that, if the chamber caved and the rope held, they could haul one another up out of the pit. The rope was a promise in cotton, rare but honest. "Light it," Nayeli said finally. Her voice did not shake. She would not have Matthew, the ranch hand, say later that she had been the one who ordered him. It was simply what needed doing. Caleb struck a match, his fingers steadier than he felt. He bent his head close to the seam, like a man about to put a candle to a funeral sheet. For a moment everything was small, the flake of orange on a wooden head, the brief flare that greased the air. He touched the flame to the fuse and drew back as if to flee a hawk's wing. The world answered like a thing that had been kept in by pressure. The charge took. There was no thunder like war films. There was physics and sound and rock obeying a new instruction. The seam unmade itself in the direction they'd chosen. A rush came through, water cold and hard like a hand opening a fist. Stone dust filled the air like a new dusk. The mine had always wanted to give way. They had bent it to open toward Dry Wolf Canyon, and the rock obliged, grumbling and sending a river through the new seam. Water found the path of least resistance and tumbled into the canyon. Inside the chamber, the pressure eased like a held breath being let go. But the mine did not go gentle. The shift snapped something further in, a collar of rock tumbling into the old chute. A part of the roof sloughed and crushed a pile of loose fill against the mouth where Nayeli's leg had been pinned. Dust threw itself into lungs. For an instant the world she had been building, lantern, rope, plan, wavered like a board in a river. They were not safe yet. "Tow me!" she shouted, because commands were quick and necessary. She seized the rope and tied her weight to the axle. Ben and Caleb heaved. The rope gnawed against rough hands. The mule above lowed in the corral. Equine panic felt as a small tether to the world. The cartwheel gave them purchase. 3 men with calloused palms and 2 old pulleys and a stubborn will pulled until the line sang in muscle. The weight in the chamber rose in a shudder, and then like a boat on tide water. Dust and stone rained behind them, but the rope held. Ben's arms burned. Caleb's face went white from the strain. Nayeli felt the skin over her ribs and knew the ledger of her body, as if it were something to be read aloud and understood. The rope pulled her through the narrow mouth. Rock clawed at her shoulder as they hauled her clear. They spilled out into morning light that had been unchanged, while the shaft had rewritten itself. Men above had been watching. Some had wept without knowing why. The mule stood with foam at its mouth. A woman sobbed somewhere behind the rim. The town's assumptions, the neat ledger that had said she was dead, crumbled in the dust at their feet. Caleb dropped to his knees and reached for her hand. She did not take it like a prize, she accepted it like an ally. Their hands were simple, dusty, honest, and mutually supportive. Silas Crow came forward then, face flushed. The match burned in the stub of his hand, like an accusation. He had tried to light a fuse, and lost the thing he had staked his plans on. He raised his chin and said with a civility that smacked of a man trying to fold a ruined map back into a drawer, "This could have been done by proper teams. You endangered the men." "You lit a second fuse," Caleb said. His voice did not shout so much as show up clean. "You tried to send the spring where it best suited you." Crow glanced at the men behind him, at the wagons with permit books that read like prayers to a paper god. "Accusations with no proof are dangerous." His tone was thinly held. "You light it, and you're proof," Ben said quietly. He stepped off the company's edge. He had the look of a man who had decided to be on the right side of a thing, even if it cost him a few coins. Ben wiped his hands on his pants and pulled from his pocket the pencil map he had given Caleb earlier and a small roll of oilcloth with notes about powder stores. He handed them to Sheriff Daniel Harper, who had come, sent by a man in town who had heard the question Caleb asked at the corral and had run to fetch the law in the same breath. Sheriff Harper was older than most men, with a face like weathered leather and a patience honed by years of keeping order between stubborn men and river claims. He took the map, then took the match stub from Crow's fingers and turned it into evidence by virtue of the way law pairs the story of a hand with an object. The stub smelled faintly of sulphur. Nayeli sat up with her shoulder pressed to the air. She supported her leg with a bandage that Ben had tightened. Her eyes missed nothing. "There was a saw mark," she said. "Someone cut the brace to make a convenient fall. Then they placed fuses to ensure the spring was forced. They meant to make this look like an accident." Silas swallowed. He was, in his own mind, a neat man who explained the world in contracts. The ledger in his head had equations for how a spring made land valuable. Now his arithmetic had become a crime. He opened his mouth to insist on the language of safety and of engineers, but the sheriff folded that language into a quiet that made Crow's words small. Sheriff Harper looked at the pile of evidence. The charred fuse stub, the sawed timber, the cartridge stashes that Ben had produced from the side chamber. He looked at Nayeli, a woman who had been in the dark and come out to give names to what the night had tried to hide. He looked at the man in the polished hat and the match, and then he made a choice that would make paperwork later, but a right thing now. He took a pair of shackles from his belt, more by habit than necessity, and said, "Mr. Crow, you're coming with me." Silas Crow protested. He did it like a man reciting the script of the wronged. He insisted his actions were licit and sensible, that if there was a misstep, it was an error of engineering, not malice. But the pairings of object and witness sat on the sheriff's chest like a small verdict. Crow's pockets contained the ledger, with penciled notations about water rights, and the name of a firm with a blind eye. The sheriff read the handwriting and read his duty. He put a hand on the man's shoulder with the firm, rightful force that says the law of men must sometimes be stronger than the law of coin. The arrest cracked the morning open. Men who had been silent, found voices. Some swore for Crow, saying he had done the company's bidding and therefore could not be wrong. Others came forward with small things, notes, crates of unexplained powder, that gave weight to the claim that this had not been a lone misjudgment, but a plan. Ben produced the map and the roll with the powder notes and the name of a clerk in town who'd been paid extra for silence. Little pieces fit together like teeth. In the days that followed, investigators came from the county, the sort who read paper and asked questions with thin faces. Permits were reviewed. A temporary stay was placed on further blasting. The company's wagons left and returned with fewer men. Papers were pulled and hands burned by them. The mine's permit was not revoked on the spot. Law does not always move like a river, but complaints were filed. The state inspector made notes. The company found itself under scrutiny, and the county found itself standing in a light that preferred to have deeds and honors clear. It would be a lie to say justice was immediate and complete. Litigation takes time. Men with ledgers have long memories and long purses. But the town had done something it had not done before. It had listened to a woman under a pile of rock and then acted. That listening had set a chain into motion that paper could not easily undo. The work of mending came next. They made a crude rescue station on the rim of Red Hollow, not out of pomp but practicality. They mapped shafts with ink and charcoal, and the slow patience of people who had learned to trace the veins of the earth. They built a small store of rope and oil and food that could be pulled up swiftly when the ground decided to be cruel. Ben oversaw the carpentry, his hands finally unburdened of secrecy. The men who had once moved like the company's shadow began to show up for sober labor, laying beams, measuring airways, putting signs that said simply, "Know before you dig." Nayeli refused any speech. She did not like speeches. She liked work, and she had medicine to tend. But people found ways to say thanks that did not need her voice. A kettle left at her door, a boy trained to fetch herbs for her, an offer that she might keep a small parcel of land near the spring for shared stewardship. The town's language softened into practical ways. Shared wells, a volunteer watch for cradles of blasting gear, a registry kept by the sheriff's office for any company coming through. Thomas's recovery was slow and stubborn in that way. Small bodies often are. He did not come back as if sprung anew. He came back the way water returns to a dry creek, first in a trickle, then with surprise. Nayeli nursed him with roots and tea, and the measured medicines she had fought to keep in her satchel. Caleb brought provisions without announcing it. He would stand at the doorway and watch the boy sleep, like a man learning to hold something dear without naming it. He brought sacks of flour and a tin of coffee, small things that mean a lot when you have spent nights in the dark. One afternoon, weeks after the dust had settled, Thomas opened his eyes and reached for a spoon of willow tea, and then laughed in a way that made his mother's shoulders loosen. It was not miraculous. It was the simple accumulation of care, of night watches and proper doses, of a community that had refused to let the child be swallowed by a tidy ledger. The fever broke, and the child's face regained the angles his life deserved. There was a quiet between Nayeli and Caleb that grew from the long work of choosing to act together. They did not flirt in wide gestures. They shared tasks. They set posts together at the new rescue station, measured rope, argued over the best place to stack beams so an emergency cart could pass. When Caleb first offered to let her ride his mare because the roads had mud and the boy had needs, she accepted without ceremony. There was a day when they walked the ridge where the spring began, mapping the water together with Ben leaning on his shovel. They spoke of stewardship. She taught him the names of herbs he had not known. He taught her the old habits of counting stock. Neither changed the other's core. They fit like two stones in a dry stream bed, different, worn, useful together. The town changed, as if bent toward a new axis. The rescue station became more than a pile of beams. Children practiced hauling rope in afternoons. Men who had once let their ledger be their conscience found themselves attending to simple things: Who kept the quiet maps? Who kept the charts of water flow? Paper remained, of course. Men depend on paper to make the world tidy. But paper now had witnesses who could read it against the smell of charred fuse and the taste of a child's rebound. Silas Crow was not the only consequence the company faced. The county inspectors found irregularities in blasting permits and in ledgers that suggested payments moved with little transparency. There were hearings, slow, bureaucratic things that chew up anger into the manageable. The company's management shuffled names and faces as businesses do, but the people of Red Hollow had gained something harder to bargain away: standards and the knowledge they could be kept. The moral of the thing was not tidy. It was not a single man's bravery. It was listening. It was the fact that a simple tap, 3 small knocks on iron, changed everything because a man pressed his ear to the rail and a woman had kept a name. Word of the rescue spread across neighboring valleys like a weathered rumor. It was told in the same cadence as other frontier stories, with small adjustments toward the heroic and the other way toward caution. Some told it as the tale of a cowboy who heard a woman in the dark. Some told it as the story of a healer who refused the dark and demanded a map. The truth sat in between like a ledger, balanced and a child saved. Nayeli did not relish being a story. She accepted a parcel of communal ground beside the spring where she might plant a small garden of medicinal roots. She taught others to gather willow and boneset without taking too much from the land. She helped write a small list, kept in the rescue station, of herbs and uses, so the knowledge was not only held in one head. She taught the children to listen, to stand with an ear to the rail, to press their cheek to iron as if to learn how to hear the earth. It was not mystical. It was practice. Caleb took up the quiet duty of watching over the station and made sure the rope stock was kept dry. He and Ben argued over the placement of a board the way old friends do. No heat, only the pleasure of being engaged with another man on something that matters. They would sit sometimes at the station after a day's work and look across the scrub to where the dry Wolf Canyon cut its teeth into the land. They would talk about weather and water and the slow politics of a frontier town that had learned it could do better. The sheriff, who had been more accustomed to settling bar fights than mining conspiracies, kept a careful file and a small pride in how the town had rallied. He visited Nayeli's hut now and then with a jug of coffee, and sometimes they spoke without the weight of legal words. Once, as they drank and watched Thomas chase a chicken across the dusty yard, he said, "You should have a hand carved for you in the new door of the rescue station. Folks ought to remember." She laughed a small, dry laugh, the way dust lifts. "A hand would be too much," she said. "Make it a notch. Let them learn to count." Months later, when the verifiers came down with official forms and cameras, men who wrote reports for people in offices far away, one of them paused by the rescue station and looked at the rope and the shelves of herbs. He scratched his head and then wrote a small note: "Community-led safety improvements recommended." It was a small sentence, but it traveled to the right desks and carried something heavier than words: a precedent. If mined land is to be shared with a town, it must be stewarded with eyes on both resources and people. They did not reforge everything that had been broken. The company's claims remained complicated and contested, but Red Hollow had made itself harder to take. The spring no longer sat on a map as a simple X to be moved. It belonged to people who knew how it ran and who would watch it. On the first winter after the event, when frost edged every blade of grass and the spring gave its small steam like a promise, the town gathered not in a house of celebration, but around a small fire by the rescue station. There were no speeches, only hands passing bread. Thomas, leaner but steady, ran about and made the adults laugh with a trick he had learned to pull a blanket more snugly over an old mule. Ben sat with a mug and told the same story he had told a dozen times, how he was once slow to act, and then a man with a patient face and a woman with roots showed him that silence was a poor ledger to keep. Nayeli stood off to one side for a moment, listening to the laughter and the slow burn of the fire. Caleb stood nearby by habit and by choice. They did not hold hands for an audience. They sat on a log close enough for shadows to mix. He passed her a wrapped tin of coffee because he knew she liked it bitter, and she passed him a strip of cured meat because she knew his hands liked solid things. It was a small exchange, respectful as the land. "You heard me," she said finally, not as a declaration, but as acknowledgement. It had happened in the dark. It had happened when a rail carried a small plea. "I did," he said. "I don't know if I'd have heard if I hadn't stopped." She looked at him then in a way that unrolled a small truth. Most folks don't press their ear to the rail. They don't expect to be answered. Caleb considered that and then nodded. "Maybe they ought to," he said. His voice had the patience of someone who had been taught to read small things. The night cooled, and the stars opened like a ledger of light. The town had its stubborn, ongoing work, mending beams, measuring springs, watching for men who would count paper before people, but they had also learned how listening binds a community. The man in a polished hat had been arrested. Evidence had been recorded. Paper had been filed, and a small culture of vigilance had been born at Red Hollow. There was an old proverb that Ben liked to repeat in his marrow-deep way: "A town is the sum of the actions of its neighbors." Red Hollow learned that if even one neighbor leans an ear to a rail, lives may change. They learned that courage does not need a certificate. It needs a partner and a rope, and a willingness to trust what's under the ground is also under one another. Spring came, the season that had nearly been stolen. The water that reached the fields ran clearer for a time, and when Thomas led a small procession of children to the spring to drop sticks and watch them float, Nayeli stood with cups of cool water and watched as the town drank. It tasted like work done right. When the sheriff's final report reached the county, it contained descriptions rather than grand pronouncements. It detailed evidence of tampering, it described steps taken for community safety, and it recommended a cautious review of the company's operations. The wheels of authority turned slow and imperfect, but they turned with more eyes upon them because people had listened. In the years that followed, Red Hollow did not become a legend of impossible feats. It became a place of small improvements and stubborn attention, a rescue station with a carved notch on the door, a communal ledger kept not only in ink, but in the memory of who knew where roots grew, a bond between a healer of the earth and a rancher who had learned to press his ear to iron. Once, when the town had quieted and a last load of lumber had been stacked by the new station, a boy asked Caleb, "Why did you go down? Weren't you scared?" Caleb looked over at the ridge where the march of the Dry Wolf Canyon cut the horizon. Then at Nayeli and the boy playing. He considered the question as if it were small and answerable. "Maybe it wasn't about courage," he said. "Maybe it was about listening. If you can hear a person under the ground, you do something about it." Nayeli, who had been tying a bundle of willow root, folded her hands and offered a small smile. "Hearing is the start," she said. "Doing is what follows." Years later, folks who passed through Red Hollow would sometimes say the same thing in a quieter way. They would tell it as an anecdote to travelers in other towns. Everyone thought she was dead until a cowboy heard her inside the collapsing mine. The phrase settled into the country like a seed, growing stories that varied the details but kept the heart. A woman who would not give up, a man who bent close to a rail, and a town that rose because it chose to listen. There was no neat romance to tie the whole into a ribbon. There was instead the slow accrual of shared work, the small domestic scenes that warm a life. Thomas's laughter under the porch roof, the rescue station's bell rung by a child who had learned what it meant, a pair of hands, one calloused from saddles, one stained with plant dye, working side by side to mend a fence. In the quiet hours, when the lanterns were banked and the stars opened like an honest map, Caleb would sometimes run his hand along the iron rail at the edge of the shaft and remember the sound. He would remember, too, the smallness of the tap that had changed things. Nayeli would walk past him and sometimes stop to press her ear there as the boy had done. Not because she expected an answer now, but because practice makes a town attentive. That is what they built. Not monuments, but practices. The rescue station, the mapped shafts, the shared stewardship of the spring, they were stitches in the fabric of Red Hollow. The town's ledger had been adjusted to show what matters. Lives saved, water kept, a community steady enough to hold one another. When the sheriff's final hearings wound toward a decision long months after the dust had settled, a clerk wrote the word "revoke" in a margin, and then underlined it as if to make certain. It was not the end of the accounting, but it was a line drawn that made future actions more careful. Men who managed mines had to be watched now. Paper would not be the only guard, people would be. On a late summer evening, as the sun bled low and the canyon cast long blue shadows, Caleb and Nayeli stood at the lip of the rescued shaft. They watched the water move along its new path to Dry Wolf Canyon, a silver thread among dust and scrub. It cut through the world like a promise kept. "You once told me to listen," she said, almost to herself. He turned and looked at her with a softness that belonged to the wide places. "You taught me what listening could do," he answered. They stood together a long time. The town filled itself with small living things, a rooster crowing, a child's shout, the measured creak of a wheel. The rescue station's bell hung quiet at the edge of town, ready. Everyone had assumed a ledger. Everyone had assumed death, but a rail carried a small sound. A man bent an ear. A woman met the darkness with a plan. The result was not a miracle, but a kind of justice, slow, practical, and collective. If you believe listening can change a life, stay with minds and ears open. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more tales of ordinary courage on the frontier. And if you'd like another, watch the next story about how communities learn to keep each other safe.